Welcome to the panel room. Today we're talking about Star Trek. Before we get started though, let's go around the room, have everyone introduce themselves. We'll go ahead and start with you, Jeannie.
It's that Adams name, it's the A thing, right?
Of course.
I'm Jeanne Adams. I write urban fantasy, paranormal romantic suspense, and space adventure with my co-panelist, Nancy Northcott. I am on this panel because I'm a huge and massive Star Trek fan.
Perfect. Keith.
I'm Keith R. DeCandido. I've been writing either for or about or both regarding Star Trek since the turn of the millennium. And I've been watching it much longer than that. I grew up watching Star Trek in the 70s and have continued to do so now. I've written more than a dozen Star Trek novels, significantly more than a dozen works of Star Trek short fiction and comic books and other things. And I've been writing about Star Trek for a variety of sources, most notably Tor.com, for quite some time. Currently, I'm in the midst of a rewatch of Star Trek Voyager for Tor, having previously rewatched the original series Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and I've been reviewing the new shows as they come out. Among my works of fiction are the two things on either side of me here. Articles of the Federation, which was a Star Trek version of The West Wing, kind of chronicling a year in the life of the Federation president. And the Klingon Art of War, which is a guide to how to live your life as a proper warrior. It's a kind of violent self-help book. And a bunch of other stuff as well. So Star Trek has been a very large part of my life, and I'm looking forward to talking about it. And I also have to show off my shirt.
I don't know if it's bad that it's a red shirt. All right, John.
Live panels, guys.
John Jackson Miller, Wisconsin resident, wearing green because of the Milwaukee Bucks, who, as we're recording, are going to be about to go for their first championship in 47 years. I am a writer of, I was going to say a writer of stuff, but that's Peter David's line. I have written for a whole lot of different franchises and also nonfiction. I worked for Comics Buyer's Guide for a decade. I have written Iron Man for Marvel, Star Wars, a lot of comics, including new re-releases just in the last month. The Old Republic Volume 4, big epic collection, and what is likely to be the heaviest book on the panel. This is the Star Wars, The Old Republic Omnibus, 1,334 pages, all mine. This is the entire Knights of the Old Republic cycle that I wrote for Dark Horse, which Marvel has finally gotten out in one 7.5-pound monstrosity. In the meantime, I also have commuted to work in the Final Frontier. Actually, Keith helped me get my first beginning taste of Star Trek fiction years and years ago, which we can get into later. But I've written, I guess at this point, 7 novels, 8 with a novella, the Prey trilogy, which borrowed liberally from ideas that Keith established in the Art of War, and then also. In the last 2-3 years, I've kind of done a novel a year. The Enterprise War, which is where Captain Pike and Enterprise were during the Klingon Wars. I guess it's now Scribe Award-winning Star Trek Die Standing, which is Emperor Georgiou's first mission for Section 31, which doesn't go as well as anyone should have thought. And then finally, coming out on August 17th, is the story about the guy who flies the La Sirena. That's Captain Rios, the novel Star Trek Picard Rogue Elements. So I've done a little of everything and a lot of some things.
All right, perfect. Jim.
I'm Jim Nettles. I write science fiction, urban fantasy, bit of horror, bit of everything. Also write a lot of nonfiction, technology, futurist, privacy type stuff. And as close as I've gotten to writing in the Star Trek universe at this point is actually using references and influences from technology. Does it influence technologists? But I've also written some anthropological type papers talking about culture and anthropology and how we see it reflected in the Trek universe. As you can see, I might be a little bit of a fan over here. The flag did fly over my wedding. However, we did not take our vows from the Klingon Art of War. I'm sorry to report, but
All right. And finally, Nancy.
I'm Nancy Northcott. As Jeannie said, we write the Outer Space Mystery Adventures Outcast Station together. I also write paranormal romance about mages fighting ghouls and demons in southern Georgia. That's the state, not the republic, near the Okefenokee Swamp. Romantic suspense, and I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books. I've been a Star Trek fan since I discovered the original series in reruns, much to the dismay of my parents, who I think had some idea where this might lead. So that's why I'm on the panel. I've lived all the generations. Well, I haven't lived all the generations of Star Trek because people tend to get killed and I wear red a lot. But I've seen all the generations of Star Trek.
All right. So first question, Nancy kind of touched on it there. I'll start with you, Keith. What is your first memory of Star Trek and why'd you keep dealing with it?
Unlike Nancy, my parents actually were the ones who sat down and watched Star Trek with me. I was raised by a roving pack of wild librarians who are also nerds. And so they actually watched Star Trek in first run when it aired in the late 60s. And when I'm from New York City, and Channel 11, one of the independent stations here in New York at the time, now it's their CW affiliate, but they used to run the reruns of Star Trek every weeknight at 6 o'clock. And that was what we did every night. My parents would come home from work, I'd come home from school, we'd watch Star Trek, and then we'd eat dinner. That was our day. And so my earliest memories are just watching the show. In particular, what stands out most vividly, because I was a very small child at the time, was being absolutely scared to death by the salt vampire in The Man Trap and the big green fat guy in The Children Shall Lead. For that reason, it was years before I would watch either episode again. I got over my fear of the salt vampire and then could enjoy The Man Trap. I still prefer not to watch In The Children Shall Lead, but that's for aesthetic reasons, not because I was scared. I stuck with it for a lot of reasons. Probably the thing that I liked most about it as a kid is the thing I still like most about it now, which is that Star Trek always defaults to the compassionate solution. The solution to the problem is very rarely shooting it or hitting it really hard or punching it or kicking it or beating it up. The solution is talking to people. The solution is compassion. The solution is understanding. The monster that seems to be killing all these people is just a mother protecting her young. For that matter, when the swirly thing is making everybody fight each other with swords, it's getting together with your enemy and laughing at it that gets rid of it. That I really liked that. I liked the fact that compassion was always the order of the day, and that people getting along with each other was always the most important thing. Even if they didn't get along, working toward that goal. That appealed to me as a kid. It still appeals to me as what passes for a grown-up. So. All
right, John.
Just to show that there's nothing that I can't turn into a commercial message. I was born the night that Star Trek: A Piece of the Action first aired in 1968. I was not actually able to watch the episode. I was otherwise engaged at the time, but I will say that it is now canon that Rios bought the La Sirena from the Iosians, and I did get to bring them back in a full-length novel, and this is one of the fun things here. But that passed. I can say that by the time I was growing up, Star Trek was on in the afternoons and on Saturdays, and I would occasionally see the animated series. It was in syndication. I remember I wrote one of my first fanzines that I did on my own when I was 11. and had done a column on how I like Star Wars better than Star Trek, because again, I was 9 when Star Wars came out. That's what you did if you were a kid. And my friend who introduced me to fanzines with his own fanzine called Stardate Now. And again, these things were like probably print runs of 8. Just circulated in middle school. He said, well, he's a couple of years older. He said, wait till you get a couple of years older and you can understand some of the stuff that's actually in the show, and you'll dig it. And I think, I did begin to appreciate it more. And in particular, what happens is, of course, after 1983, Star Wars, lies fallow for many years. I mean, it goes away. It doesn't come back for a very long time until George Lucas gets divorced and needs money. And literally that is what, it prompts him to come back into the fold of making movies based on Star Wars. But Star Trek, of course, was still out there. And I had started reading some of the novels at that point. By then, we had gotten Trek 2, Trek 3. Trek 3 is probably one of my favorite movies of the franchise, which is again why I brought Krug back. It just sort of won me over. And then, of course, by the time I get to college, Next Gen starts, and Next Gen gives me the chance to experience it from the beginning, the same way that people did in the 60s. And so, once I actually got to become immersed in it that way, that kind of sells you for life.
All right. Jim.
Yeah, I'm very much the same way. I mean, I grew up watching the Star Trek reruns, in the middle of the afternoon, come home from school. That was what was coming on. I grew up watching, some of the Westerns and stuff with Dad. And so I recognized it being basically wagon train in space, even as a kid. But it was, the first thing was, the cultures and the monsters and all the kind of good stuff you got to see. But then once you get to diving into the cultures and you saw how they tried to reflect different points of history and a lot of the cultural stuff, even hung with me at a very young age. And so that was the first thing that grabbed me. And then, I saw Star Trek 1 in the theater. I saw Star Trek 2 in the theater. I saw all of them in the theater ultimately. Including going and sitting through Generations, but that's a different story. But that was really my thing, was watching it and growing up with it. And, much like John, I came up and it was that very early thing of Star Wars or Star Trek. And I was like, well, you can do both. They're very different. Yeah. But that was enough, to get you beaten up on the playground. So that sounded like a reason to start a fight. You can have both. That's why you put R2-D2 on the bridge of the Enterprise, and that's where Data came from. I take all the credit.
All right, Nancy.
Well, I discovered Star Trek, the original series reruns, in high school. I went to this program North Carolina had called Governor School, which was not actually a prison. It was summer classes for geeks of various disciplines. And in the afternoon, there was a TV lounge in the dorm where we were staying in Winston-Salem. And I went down there one afternoon expecting to watch the reruns of Daniel Boone, starring Fess Parker and Ed Ames. But no, there was this science fiction show on. And I had sort of seen it, but y'all know that big face from the Corbomite maneuver that was on the closing credits? My mother took one look at that and said, "You are not watching that show," because she thought it would give us bad dreams and that we would be up all night and keep her and my father up all night. But, she wasn't there at Governor School. And so we watched this episode, and I'd always liked science fiction. Books like Zip Zip and His Flying Saucer, Venus Boy, Dig Allen Space Explorer. Granted, the science in those is what we might call dubious anymore, but they were wonderful action adventure, and they were about people doing the right thing. And I didn't think of it in the terms that Keith did of always the compassionate solution, but it was a lot of action adventure and people trying to do the right thing. It's like in Camelot when they talk about might for right. It's the same kind of thing. And it really appealed to me a lot. And so it got to be a race that those of us who wanted to watch Star Trek would try to beat the people who wanted to watch Daniel Boone to the TV lounge every afternoon. And, if we didn't win the race, we went off and did something else because, you know, compared to Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock and Lieutenant Uhura zipping around in the Enterprise. I mean, I'm sorry, Daniel Boone on the Frontier just didn't quite cut it anymore. But I would like to actually speak to one thing that Keith mentioned. You talked about the mother defending her young, the episode The Devil in the Dark with the Horta. I taught a class on science fiction, fantasy, and society at UNC Charlotte for a couple of semesters. And I included The Devil in the Dark and The City on the Edge of Forever in the class. And I was really disappointed that the students were so distracted by the, let's face it, comparatively primitive special effects that it was very hard to get them to focus on the point that the show was trying to make. So I've just sort of hoped that they've kind of all gone on and developed a greater appreciation for the plot rather than the superficial trappings. Because yeah, those old episodes, they're kind of clunky by modern standards, but they made some really good points.
Yes, on the one hand, the Horta is a scary monster. On the other hand, it really does look like a pan pizza.
All right, Jeannie.
Well, I'm the youngest of four, and my older brothers thought that show was the bomb. And so, but my dad thought, just like Nancy's parents, my dad was like, yeah, the little one might give him nightmares. And so even in reruns, might give you nightmares. But in the late 70s, I was just a kid. Gene Roddenberry did a circuit around the country with blooper reels. So my first actual visual exposure to Star Trek, other than my brothers whispering and talking about it, and me going, what are you talking about? Was going to the university and hearing Gene Roddenberry talk about all of the stuff that had gone into making it and then showing the blooper reel. Well, I was young enough that I don't really remember all the stuff he talked about. I remember that blooper reel like it was yesterday. To see Spock walk into the doors, and because they don't open, the sound effect occurs, and then see Leonard Nimoy absolutely crack up is one of those things that has just stayed with me forever. Because, you know, throughout the run of the show, he is Spock, right? He is this stern, unemotional thing. Nimoy is just, and you can see they bleeped it, of course. So there were so many things just in the blooper reel that were absolutely revolutionary. Uhura and the medical setup and the aliens, and I'm going, I gotta watch this show. So of course I went home and did the then equivalent of binge watching it. You know, it would come on Saturday afternoon and there'd be 2 episodes, and then on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday there'd be a few episodes at odd times, you know. So I managed to get all of them in over the next year or two and read the books that had begun. It was just the very beginning in the late 70s, just the very beginning of the tie-in novels. And so I just gobbled all of those up. So that was Gene Roddenberry and the blooper reel. That was my first exposure to Star Trek.
All right, perfect. So the next one, I'll start with you, John. What is your favorite iteration of Star Trek? You know, we've got each of the different series. We've got the comics. We've got
I think Next Gen, you know, the middle seasons, again, for what I was explaining before, that it was what I was actually able to immerse myself in, as it came out, and particularly, you know, using the TV trope, once the series grows the beard, and which is of course the opposite of jumps the shark, and you have, they're through that sort of initial growing pain phase, and really, you know, as soon as they set foot on Kronos, I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm in. We've got the Klingons with an entire society that we have seen some of already in episodes in the first and second season, but now I wrote a whole trilogy about undoing discommodation. So clearly, I'm Sins of the Father, Rightful Heir, all of these episodes, that tie in with the Klingons, really, to me, made it a lot more interesting. It was also the fact that, I was a journalism student, but I was also an international relations student. And I would go on to get a Soviet studies master's degree that would become fairly useless because the Soviet Union collapsed on my dissertation. But the point, though, was I like the politics. I like the Romulans and the Klingons and the everybody, bustling up against one another. I find that interesting. There's a lot more players than Rebels versus Empire. And there's a lot of different ways that you can throw these cultures at each other. And as they begin to, flesh these things out, and it's really Next Gen that does this, you get the kind of stories that you can do in Deep Space Nine. You get the kind of, longer form stories that we're able to do in the novels. You're able to get the kind of, encyclopedias that we're able to do of the history, because now there's something there, and it's not just the province of the role-playing game designers who are having to just sort of fill in whatever they can fill in. So yeah, I mean, I think that's really, if we're to say, this is high Star Trek for me. I think that is that's a very important phase of it for me.
Yeah, I agree. The first couple seasons of Next Gen were a little rough. I did a rewatch of Farpoint before this. I don't know. I loved it at the time because, like you, that was right at my junior year of high school when that came out, and to be a part of Star Trek history with it coming back. But Jim, how about you? What's your favorite iteration?
Well, that's a little bit like asking what's your favorite book.
Or
But
child?
the one that was really probably most impactful for me in a lot of ways was DS9, because it was the first time you really see a collective universe that it's not the ship jumping to a new story every week or every 2 episodes if it was a packaged one. And it was much more centered around cultural aspects. I was fascinated and really interested in the spiritual exploration it went through, the cultural exploration, and the way they were able to set up this transition of power, the way they were able to go through and create a much more of an ongoing conflict that was much more of that spy versus spy. There were some storylines I'd really like to have seen much more. But I mean, there was so much of a dance there, and you saw the character development week over week. You saw story development week over week. And everybody talks about it being a little bit darker. But if you also look at things like Cisco and his son, the familial relationship there, if you look about how some of the different people, you didn't have just 2 sides here. You really had a lot of players having to figure out how to integrate and work together, and that made for a lot larger story base. But the first thing that actually grabbed me, we were going to go out, go see a band the night that it premiered. We already had the VCR set. Yes, kids, that's that old thing with tape in it. We'd already set the VCR up. It was ready to go, but we were like, yeah, let's watch the first couple of minutes and see what happens to see what it looks like. And they broke into that battle of Wolf 359, and some of the friends were going out and they're like, let's go. We're like, yeah, we'll be there. And
Bye-bye now.
We stood there and watched the first 15 minutes of that as to how they went through that whole story. It was like, okay, hooked. We still went and saw the band. We got back at like 2 a.m, popped open some more beer, and it was like, let's watch it. And we watched it a couple of times over the next couple of days. And I mean, that was just set and hooked.
Nancy?
It's very hard to bump me off of whatever I first fall in love with. So I will always have the original series in the center of my heart. But Deep Space Nine, as Jim said, was probably the most complex world that they had. I think Odo is maybe one of the best roles Rene Auberjonois ever had. And there was a scene where Kira was confronting the Cardassians, and I don't remember what the Cardassian character said. It was something like, "We'll raise your cities and stomp on your bones," or that kind of thing. And she said something like, "Well, bring it on. I'm just a Bajoran who's been fighting Cardassians all my life." And I thought, I love this woman. I love this woman. And with Voyager, I remember Kate Mulgrew from the soap opera Ryan's Hope. And so I was surprised and then really pleased when she became the captain of the Enterprise, because I thought, even though she's not a very large woman physically, she had a big presence and she did a great job. And I love Michelle Yeoh,
Michelle Yeoh. Yeah.
Thank you, who was the captain on Discovery. And I have a feeling that Discovery may come pretty close to bumping the original series into second place, but I've just started watching it, so I don't know. So if I can only pick one, which I think is a really unreasonable rule, I'll go with
I just said favorite. I didn't say only one.
Okay, all right.
All right, Jeannie.
Well, I'm gonna just laugh about Nancy saying it's hard to, she will not be moved, because she won't.
Shall not pass.
That's right,
That's
she
right.
shall not pass. That's a whole nother story. I'm sort of with the consensus on, I love all of it. All of it has elements that speak to who I am and what I love. But in some ways, what you said earlier, Keith, about the compassionate choice, the push me, pull you, constant churn of what is the right compassionate choice on Deep Space Nine was something that just absolutely captivated me. That they essentially took a hometown and all of the various people and factions and groups in it, no matter what they looked like, and made it work. And when it didn't work, that was the story. And it was also one of the most widely diverse casts of any of the Star Trek ones. I went back and actually looked at the casts to see, because I always had that impression, but it is in fact one of the most widely diverse casts in terms of the hiring. And they just did that with such ease and grace, and natural acceptance of, oh, well, it's this kind of creature, it's that kind of creature. And there's always sort of a, especially in the original one, there's always sort of a, hey, look, it's a creature. And again, while that during the time, that was sort of the whole thing. Oh, wow, there are other creatures out there. It does tend to come off as a little bit of, student play. Creature, look at the creature. And in Deep Space Nine, it is just that, here is the vast panoply of the universe, deal with it. And that makes it my out. It goes to the top, but everybody else is sort of like jostling for a hot second. So,
Keith?
I'm going to cheat and say all of it.
all of
Because
the
because there has, since the show debuted, there has never been a time when there wasn't something. When the show went off the air, there were the reruns, there were the James Blish adaptations, and then there were the Bantam novels, and God help us, the Gold Key comic books. And then, by in the mid 70s, you got the animated series and Alan Dean Foster's adaptations of those. You got, throughout the late 70s, you got some really out there novels. Some of them were brilliant, some of them were horrible, but they were at the very least trying to, tell new stories with them. And you got some people like Joe Haldeman and David Gerald, and
you did some great stuff.
Yeah, and
some of those novels were not Trek novels to begin with. They just said, "Go ahead."
Yeah, but still, you got some cool stuff. And then it came back in 1979, and then there was a whole new set of, Simon and Schuster picked up the license, which they still have now, 40 odd years later. And even though you got a movie every couple of years, Marvel did their comics line after the motion picture, and then DC picked up the license, did some wonderful comics for years. Facet did their role playing game, and then in '86 they announced it was going to be a new TV series in time for the 20th anniversary. And then you really had, from 1987 until 2005, there was always at least one and sometimes two Star Trek shows on the air, and a new movie every couple of years, and more comic books, and more, more, just a constant stream of stuff. Nobody could hold on to the comics license for more than 5.5 seconds, but you still got some cool comics out of it, whether they came from DC, from Marvel, from IDW, from Tokyo Pop, whoever, from Wildstorm. And same thing with the gaming license for that matter. And then you started getting online games. You got all sorts of cool CD-ROM stuff throughout the 90s when that was a thing. And then even when Enterprise went off the air in 2005, at that point, in the fiction, which was a time when I was working on a lot of Star Trek fiction, there was a ton of stuff going on in the fiction because we had been given permission to continue the series forward after they ended. So there were Next Generation novels that took place after Nemesis. There were Deep Space Nine and Voyager and Enterprise novels that took place after those shows ended and continued those stories forward. So we got to do all the level of creativity in the fiction line skyrocketed because we were freed more than most tie-in novels could do. And then in 2009, a new movie came out. And then in 2017, now we're getting a ridiculous, in terms of television, we're getting a plethora of stuff. There's already, we've already had 3 shows, and we've got, 2 more coming down the pike. One literally down the pike. It's Strange New Worlds, but and more after that. There's a commitment to doing more and more stuff. There's been a constant stream of it, and there's always something new for new people to jump onto. There's a lot of people for whom Discovery is their Star Trek because it was the first one they were exposed to. And they're, and it's great that and in particular, I think what led to it to some extent is, and I'm going to cite Deep Space Nine again, because Deep Space Nine changed what Star Trek was. Up until 1993, Star Trek was, these are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise.
Right.
And then when DS9 debuted, it changed that. Then it opened it up to anything. And it wasn't just, like John said, it was left to like the novels and the role-playing games to do anything outside that particular box. Starting in January of 1993, anything went, and anything has continued to go. And now we have shows that take place in the 23rd century and in the 31st century and in the 24th century, and and we can just jump all over the timeline and jump to different types of ships, types of stories being told, and it's wonderful. And the universe is just so wonderfully flexible and open to so many different types of stories, and they've been told in so many different formats and are continuing to be 50 odd years later.
All right. So my next question, Jim, we've talked a little bit about this in the sense that Star Trek seems to constantly be pushing limits in relation to our real world as we do it. We had whether it was the first interracial kiss in the original series, the thought of a female captain in Voyager, all these different limits that are being pushed. Are there any times that you can think of that you think they went too far, or times they didn't go far enough?
Well, I mean, if you go back to original series, there's a lot of times that they really pushed the wall up to where the censors would let it go. And there's nothing I can look at and go and say, oh, they didn't take that far. Oh, there's a lot of things I could probably look at and say they didn't take it far enough. There's really not a lot of things I can look at and say, well, they pushed that one too far. But I mean, science fiction and fantasy has always been the realm of politics. It's always been the realm to explore concepts, ideas, and do it in a way that was a little more palatable to a lot of people. But I mean, if you look at original series, a lot of the things that they did and got away with, and the story elements they used to get away with it, really helped push things forward. And I mean, that was one of those things that they got permission because they could say, oh, well, it's an alien creature. It's not human. Or they were under an undue influence, or there was always a reason for it, but there was always a reason and a way to break the rules. And that, I think, was one of the beautiful things about original series. But as we come forward now, it's a lot harder to find those walls sometimes to really bump up against. And I think that sometimes means we get creative in a lot of interesting ways. But sometimes we can push the political message beyond the story. And I think that's where sometimes we outrun, and it doesn't happen too often in the Star Trek universe. I've seen it happen a lot more in some other franchises where you push something politically beyond what the story can carry. And that just means, do you carry the story further, or do you at least carry those implications through? And I think that's the other thing that DS9 was able to do, was when you reflect some of these more complex stories, they could actually show that there were real implications to the change coming about. One of those things and one of those times I think that really kind of bumps up against it's not always the peaceful solution. And I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it was during the Maquis Wars, where Sisko comes and says, yes, we're going to make this planet uninhabitable for the next 50 years, because he's trying to hunt one person. And the guy, basically hologram into the ship, standing there, and he's like, you're bluffing. And Sisko's like, launch. All right, set a course for the next one. Surrender or we're done. And there were those kinds of implications. If you look at when Worf went back to go save Dax, and Sisko comes in and says, I know why you did it. I appreciate it, but understand that's also the reason you'll never become a captain. There were some very transformative moments that for the characters were critical, that showed, no, there really are repercussions. It wasn't just violate the Prime Directive this week. And so that's where I think they had a lot of opportunity to carry the stories further, versus if you look at a lot of the storylines in Next Gen, those are still pretty sanitized. I mean, it was still late 80s, early 90s. I think there were a lot of stories there that they could have carried further, but it was the time it was, and you still had the censors. But I think that's really what we usually saw, was the stories often could have let them carry it further than they actually did, but they bumped up against what was going to be palatable for the time.
Nancy?
Well, before I answer the question, I would just like to make a comment, which is that having listened to Jeannie's answer, I now understand why, when we were creating an imaginary world, she said, I want to write stories about the space station. So she does. But, I was just listening to what Jim was saying, and I really can't add a lot to it. But there's an episode that sticks in my mind. The guest stars were Frank Gorshin, who subsequently became, in my opinion, the best Riddler ever, and Robert Brown, who went.
Actually, that was after it was the Riddler. It was the Riddler before.
Okay.
Yeah.
I get confused about which comes first. Thank you. So, but I still think he was the best Riddler ever.
Oh, yeah.
And Robert Brown, who had been trying to get a town full of women had gotten a town full of women to come from Salem, Massachusetts to marry his logger brothers and friends in Here Come the Brides. So it was kind of a different role for both of them. But the whole show was about their civilizations having been at war, because each of them had a face that was half black and half white, but the sides were flipped. And the show ended with one of them, and I can't remember now which one it was, luring the other one into like an interdimensional rift to fight him forever to prevent a big war. And even though I was only in high school, that episode really made a big impression on me. And like Jim said, the only reason they got away with that, I think, is because it's like, well, these are aliens. They don't have anything to do with us. These are those people over there. Obviously, they're all messed up. But I think one of the things that makes Star Trek attractive to a lot of people is that effort to do the right thing. And they step out with doing things like having a black man and his son be the central family on Deep Space Nine, having a woman be the captain of the Enterprise, and oh Lordy Pete, wasn't there a fight about that at the time. And then I spend too much time on Twitter, and there's always a thing on Twitter about, oh, I want to return to the days when comic books were not political. And you just want to go, have you ever read X-Men? I mean, it's just.
Read the original Superman, for crying out loud.
Yes.
I made Tony Stark the Secretary of Defense for a year. He had to be Senate confirmed. It was political.
And the recent one-shot Superman Smashes the Klan was hugely popular and very popular. And so nothing I'm thinking about really makes me think they didn't go far enough or they went too far. But I think one of the values of Star Trek is that it does things that break the mold and make you think. And there's always going to be a segment of people who are unhappy with anything that's not consistent with their personal worldview. And Star Trek doesn't care. And it manages to succeed anyway. Yeah. And so I kind of dodged your question, but that's the best answer I've got for you.
Jeannie.
Well, I think that the fact that they can couch it in interdimensional space time continuum terms allows them so much leeway story-wise that there really isn't a boundary they can't push. I think the first series, the original series, probably pushed the boundaries the hardest. But like Nancy said, they've continued to do that all along the continuum. They push it every chance they get. And I think that it's part of the culture of the world building, and not only the show, but the books and everything else is to push it a little bit. And yet they really are telling stories about all of us and where we're at. And so to my mind, they probably, especially now, have the leeway to push it harder. I think Discovery's doing some of that in sort of a backdoor way, because, they've kind of got us all hooked into, okay, what is she going to do now? And so I think they have, in some ways, because of what's happening in the world and everything, I think they have an open field to push a lot of boundaries, and I hope they'll continue to do it. I hope they'll take Gene Roddenberry's spirit and just really push it.
All right.
So that's my sideways answer to the question.
Star Trek is always, as everybody's already said, it's always pushed the boundaries. The very act of
the Romulans attack.
Yeah.
The Klingons attack.
Okay. The very act of putting a black woman, an Asian man, and a Russian dude on the bridge of the Enterprise with working peacefully alongside the white folks, and it never actually being commented on. The closest it came to being commented on was Chekhov's silly comments about how everything is a Russian invention. But aside from that, the fact, and this in the late 60s, that was huge. This was at a time when people who looked like Mr. Sulu were the people we were fighting a war against in Southeast Asia, and the people who looked like Uhura were responsible for a great deal of justified civil rights unrest. And people who sort of sounded like Chekhov were the people who we were afraid were going to drop a bomb on us. And I say sort of because his Russian accent was terrible, but that's a whole other. And here they were all working together for what was initially established as a United Earth and later became a United Federation of Planets. That was, in the height of the Cold War, in the height of the turmoil of the late 60s, that was incredibly ballsy. And very optimistic, and very, to use that was the late 1960s version of woke, and that continued going forward. Not so much with Next Gen. Next Gen did play things a little safer, but also they were trying to they were trying to establish that you could do a Star Trek spinoff, which people forget this, but in 1987, lots of people were really pissed off about the Next Generation. How dare you do Star Trek without Kirk, Spock, and McCoy? That can't possibly work. Nothing changes. But so they played it relatively safe, although the choice of an older British bald guy as the dashing hero kind of threw everybody for a loop. But then, and then having an African American man be the head of the station in Deep Space Nine, having a woman captain of Voyager was also pushing the envelope. Even now, if you look at the history of science fiction and fantasy TV shows, the number of leads who are people of color is vanishingly small, and 2 of them are Star Trek. And that they've always done that. By the same token, there's lots of ways where I wish they did push things further. Probably the most obvious is their complete inability until the current Secret Hideout shows to actually address non-heteronormative relationships. Their attempts to do so were hilariously ham-fisted and frankly pathetic. And this was, and especially, you know, when Next Gen and DS9 were on the air, this was at a time when you first started seeing LGBTQ representation on television. And other shows were pushing the envelope that Star Trek should have been pushing and hadn't been. But overall, it's what Star Trek has always done. Just from simple acts of casting. And just by continuing to show a united Earth. An Earth where it doesn't, the fact that Sisko is black and the fact that Bashir is an Arab is completely irrelevant to their character. The fact that Sisko is an engineer and a chef is more important than the fact that he's black. The fact that Sulu jumps from hobby to hobby every week is more important than the fact that he's Asian. The fact that Uhura sings is more important than the fact that she's got darker skin. That's still a very radical and hopeful message 50 odd years later, which is kind of sad. But I find myself reminded, there's a great line. Arlo Guthrie had a wonderful line talking about his father, Woody Guthrie, who wrote This Land Is Your Land and a lot of protest songs. And he said, you know, it's amazing that, you know, years later, you know, decades after he wrote these songs are still, you know, relevant and have resonance today. On the other hand, it's kind of sad that the world still sucks. And that's unfortunately true of Star Trek as well.
But, you know, I think it still keeps pushing the boundaries in terms of making us see a world we could have in a way that is palatable to a wide variety of humans to go, oh yeah, of course that can happen. And yeah, of course. And if it even changes one mind, it's done its job.
And even, you know, the current shows you're seeing on Discovery, you're seeing people you don't normally see on television. You're seeing someone in Tilly who is a non-traditional thinker and who doesn't look like the average female on TV. She's somebody who's actually a large woman who is smart and mouthy, which is not a type you see very often on television.
She's an engineer.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
But and we're actually seeing non-heteronormative relationships. We're seeing trans people. And my personal favorite, one of the things I love about the Picard show is that we are actually seeing, we almost always on television see characters who are at the height of their ability or powers or whatever. Because we wouldn't want to watch a TV show about them if they weren't. But what I like in Picard is we're seeing somebody who's past that. Somebody who's past his prime, who is no longer the captain of the flagship. He's no longer as relevant as he once was. And what does he do now that he is in the twilight of his life and past his prime?
And everybody else is a mess. So
Also that,
I mean,
yes.
Yeah, I mean, I got 130,000 words of him being a mess.
But you know, I also think it's really important too, like in Discovery, we're seeing people all along the spectrum of their careers.
Yes.
We're not seeing just the pinnacle. We're seeing people, and you know, I think it was logical for us to see the people in the pinnacle of their careers in terms of Star Trek, because you're going to put your best on the flagship. You're going to put those people out there on the front point of the spear when you're going to investigate things and, you know, brave new worlds and all that. But now your average starship is going to have people along the spectrum. You know, you're going to have the engineer who's grade 1. You just got the 1 tab, and you're going to go and learn from the people who know what they're doing. You've got the book learning, now you got to get the on-the-job training. I like that. I like the fact that we're seeing the spectrum, and I think it's pure Star Trek that's sort of that they're doing it and nobody else is.
Well,
we've seen so many captains who were already in the position. You know, they were established. They were already captains when the show started, or at least commanders in Sisko's case. And you get the impression that, you know, they're all ready for that. One of the things I'm enjoying in Discovery with both Burnham and Saru is that you're seeing the process by which they became captains.
Yeah.
You know, they're both of them are explicitly on the command track when the show starts, but neither of them are in command yet. and we get to see both of them over the course of all 3 seasons of the show working their way to becoming good captains.
Right.
Which is not a
Well,
process we've really seen before. Which,
well,
you know,
and it
when you've got
follows the whole-
55 years of storytelling, you got to, you know, mix it up a little.
And it also follows the whole thing of, you know, you become experienced by, you become good at making decisions by having experience, and sometimes you gain experience by making really bad decisions.
Really bad.
Well,
Yeah,
and I
there
think that's one.
was a Next Gen episode about that when Counselor Troy wanted to become a bridge officer.
Right.
And she had to go through the learning process and make some mistakes to do that. I'm not sure that really fits for the ship's counselor so much as it would fit for perhaps crewman A in a not red shirt. But I thought it was an interesting episode, and it was kind of a change of pace.
Yeah.
To hit the original question while I still remember it, and what I was going to
Sorry.
say. No, it's okay. It's all good. It's been a long day. After all my hobbies became my job, I needed a new hobby. So I got obsessed with television history. And so I have over 1,200 TV guides. I'm being treated for it. I looked to see what I had within reach. All I've got is Arsenio Hall as TV Person of the Year. But I assure you, I did have eBay show up this morning with the 1971 As the World Turns cover I'd been looking for all these years. The reason
I wish I'd known. I just recycled about 75 pounds of TV guides.
Oh, well, you know, depending on what they are, some people are into just the ones from their state or their market. And it's kind of nuts because there's 180 different versions. But what interests me about it is you get context. You find out what was going on at the time that was influencing what people were seeing. And this is something that people now, for better or worse, don't get. They get streaming. So they see every series in order, whether that's the best way to watch the series or not. They also have it completely divorced from whatever was going on, competitively in television or in terms of rules. We talked about what they could do on the original series. Really, it was more what they couldn't do on the original series because they had network standards and practices. You get to Next Gen, you're syndicated. You don't have network standards and practices, but you have different things pressing on you. And then, of course, once we get to the streaming series, you can do whatever you want within certain things. And likewise, I look at things like, people watching Deep Space Nine now, for example, will not remember Babylon 5. Babylon 5 and DS9 were at war basically within fandom at the same time. And it's a big, long thing that anybody who was in there and reading J. Michael Straczynski's postings on Genie at the time, when Deep Space Nine got out before Babylon 5 could, there's this, I would have to rewatch the entire series from the beginning, I think, to be able to say, okay, there's not this battle going on between which show could be darker, which show could be, which show could be more realistic, more cynical, more, some of the things that we applaud in DS9, they're doing horrible things over here in Babylon 5. And that's not there if you're watching it fresh. And I almost envy people watching it fresh because that's the way the creators intended it to be. But
I envy anybody who didn't have to sit through that nonsense in the 90s, believe me.
Well, I mean, it was the stuff we were all going through in fandom. And yeah, I mean, Star Wars versus Star Trek, that's something that's, way, way, way out there. Now it's all of us versus manga, or whatever else it happens to be. I don't know. But I think that is, that's something that, we kind of, it's not just knowing what was going on in the world at the time, but what was going on in television at the time. There's no way to understand Enterprise without understanding UPN and what was happening with that network, so to speak.
Yeah, but even the people running UPN didn't understand.
Well, yeah, I mean, and people now are trying to evaluate decisions that were made on Enterprise that are not aware of what was happening in television at the time and what was happening with Paramount at the time, what was happening. And I find that stuff fascinating, but that's that may not be everybody. But I think that's there's a Discovery episode, Context is for Kings. At least it's for geeks anyway. And I'd be one of them.
What's interesting is that Star Trek has often, since it was on the air, tried to find new ways of getting out to its audience.
Oh, yeah.
The originally what eventually became the motion picture was originally supposed to be another TV show. Paramount wanted to form its own network back in the mid 70s and launch it with Star Trek Phase 2, and then that collapsed under the weight of its own ridiculousness, and they tried it again 20 years later, obviously with UPN and launching it with Star Trek Voyager, but then it became the motion picture. Nobody did syndicated dramas until Next Gen did it in 1987, and then you had a huge wave of tons of syndicated dramas, including Babylon 5, throughout the late 80s and early 90s. There was an explosion of mostly science fiction shows that were released that way. And then, Star Trek launched at that point, I think it was the sixth network in 1995. And then again, in the original intent was for Discovery to launch what was then called CBS All Access, except it got delayed, so it didn't. But the whole point of what is now Paramount Plus, the backbone of that was and still is the various Star Trek shows. Finding new way, doing its own, CBS basically trying to do its own streaming thing. Star Trek has been constantly used that.
Wouldn't you say too that really, honestly, I think at least it feels to me that Star Trek fandom is what began to drive the cons and the appearances, and there were some before, there were some that were very popular before, but there wasn't the sort of surge of impact and interest until you had, Nimoy and
well, certainly the media / comics convention that you see all over the place now got its start with the Star Trek Lives convention.
And you get the streams crossed because the magazine that I worked for, Comics Buyer's Guide, which was a weekly going back to 1971, Chekhov, Walter Koenig, took out a full-page advertisement in that newspaper looking for pinback buttons because he collected them. And the first line of the ad was, "Hi, I played Chekhov on Star Trek. Now that I have your attention," because he knew that his fans were comics fans.
Tribe. That is my tribe.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I think that fed some of the serious movies and stories that came out that, they're not fan fiction of Star Trek by any means, but they are definitely pay homage to it. And then there's the ones that are absolutely direct spinoffs like Galaxy Quest, which I absolutely adore and laugh my way through every time.
It is by far the best Star Trek movie.
It is.
Yeah.
And yet, that's part of it we haven't really talked about, is what they've influenced. I mean, Jim, you mentioned it a little bit in terms of, the tech and science. The question you asked Jason about the tech and science is that, some of that stuff just simply showing that it was possible, imagining it as possible, drove the technology to look, tricorders, all those things, cell phones, flip phones, just the very idea that we could have those things held in our hand as hand-sized things. Why not? Okay, cool. Let's try and fix it. Let's try and make it that way. I think it drove so many things that are subtle and probably are not ever going to be directly acknowledged. That, hey, I wanted to design a tricorder, so I went to work for NASA.
Well, NASA is full entirely of people who grew up watching some form of Star Trek or other.
Yeah.
There was there was a great story. Nichelle Nichols told a wonderful story when she was at the Shore Leave Convention in Baltimore a bunch of years ago about how she it was when Mae Jemison was about to launch. She was the first African-American female astronaut. And Nichelle Nichols called NASA because she just wanted to wish her luck. It was like the night before. and she kept getting bounced from person to person through NASA because nobody would connect her to Jemison because everybody wanted to say hello to her. So she kept getting bounced from, oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Nichols, hang on, we'll transfer you. And they just kept so people could all geek out. There was actually a documentary that was just released recently called Woman in Motion, which is about how throughout the 70s, Nichelle Nichols actually worked with NASA to do outreach to get more people of color and more women involved in the space program. And you know, there's a huge crossover between people who got involved in the space program and people who grew up watching one form of Star Trek or other.
Yeah. But you think about that. One show that lasted a couple seasons made all that impact that has rolled forward for 50 years and continues to roll forward unabated. making two people's careers very happy.
Yeah. and still, I mean, most of the actors who are currently working on the Star Trek shows are Star Trek fans. You know, Anthony Rapp, Sonequa Martin Green, Michelle Hurd, all of them are like massive geeks and are like completely thrilled at the fact that they're getting to act in Star Trek. Doug Jones also, you know, Mary Wiseman, all of them, you know, these are all nerds who are now getting.
Well, and I think that goes back to the idea of look at the late 60s, how much it took of a fight to get Star Trek on the air to start with.
Yeah.
The fact that Lucille Ball was the big fan, you know, Desilu Productions, what it took to get a second season and then eking out a third season. You know, it's that seed of creativity that started all of this. And then it took a little while for that idea of TV execs going, oh, I guess geeks can spend money too. Because it all boils back to the advertisers. But I mean, I really believe that if we look at all the things that it spun off and started in the 60s, that it has a much greater cultural influence beyond just all the people it's influenced, the technology it's influenced. I think that in a lot of ways it has definitively shaped much of our culture where we're sitting at now, even for people who've never seen an episode or never seen a show that would be like, what could that possibly have to do to me? And every geek that's out there, the influence that we've had on technology, on culture, all the moving pieces around us, it's amazing to me that somebody could possibly think that it hasn't had an influence on our culture at large.
And it's had an influence on television too. Both in particular, the original series and Next Generation both came at a time when the alternatives for science fiction were few and far between, and a lot of them were terrible. One of the reasons why Gene Roddenberry pitched Star Trek as Wagon Train to the Stars is he specifically wanted what was then viewed as sophisticated television, which was something like Wagon Train, where you had a regular group of characters plus interesting guest stars who would come through and there would be stories about them. He wanted something classy, not something disposable like You're Lost in Space or Captain Video or whatever. He wanted something that was smarter than that. Same thing with Next Generation. Jason, you were talking before about how you watched Farpoint again recently, and it looked, and you were, and yes, watching Farpoint now, you go, what were we thinking liking this? But look at what the alternatives were in 1987. They were horrible.
Well, that goes back to what John was saying, is you almost have to look at it in context.
Exactly. Yeah. And Next Generation really paved the way for a spectacular renaissance in science fiction television that we're still enjoying the fruits of now.
Well, I mean,
35 years later.
And again, here we go again with the context. Those early episodes, Farpoint lands when Max Headroom is still on, which is I still believe probably the greatest science fiction series ever, besides Star Trek. To unbelievably have been on network TV, and they threw it off as soon as they realized it was on. But again, that's part of the context. Is you're beginning to get interesting ideas in science fiction on again, and it's no longer Manimal. It's no longer V at that point. It's no longer.
More to the point, it's not V the final battle.
Yeah, well, but it was popular. Oh my gosh, the ratings were huge.
Oh yeah,
the ratings were huge.
That's because we were going to take it however we could get it. I mean, that's part of the thing is, it didn't matter how bad it was, you took what you could get.
And I think that goes back to something you mentioned, Keith, is that or maybe you said it, Jim, is the deep underestimation of how many geeks are out there that will watch just about
was you.
anything if you will give it to us with interesting characters.
Shut up and take my money.
Exactly. And you know, the incredible popularity of Game of Thrones, people are like, wow, this is so popular. I'm like, have you been to Dragon Con? I mean, really?
But that
Well,
gets
you can
back
just
to
take
what
one look at Atlanta in Labor Day weekend, and you can go, oh yeah, we can pull that off.
Well, the most popular movies in the history of the universe feature Marvel superheroes, you know?
Yeah.
But you know, that gets back to what I think it was Jeannie who mentioned the conventions. There's actually a book about that called The Making of the Trek Conventions by the women who put the first Trek convention together. They were going to be happy if they got 100 people. And instead, they had fire marshal issues at the hotel because people heard, and then more people heard, and then more people heard, and more people came. And for geeks, it was like, I'm not alone. Because a lot of us were the only people. I mean, yes, I'm projecting a little here because this was me, but I know that there were plenty of other people like that too, who were surrounded by people who didn't care at all about this stuff, who were waiting for you to grow up and outgrow it. And then all of a sudden, here's this gathering where you plunk down a little money at the door and you spend the whole weekend with people like you. And they love the same stuff you love that other people think is weird. And that just goes to show how stupid those other people are. And so, you know, it's like one of the other things that it did was help to make being a geek acceptable. I mean, I got Christmas tickets to John Roddenberry's tour with the blooper reel. That was my Christmas present that year. And there were people from all walks of life. The guy sitting down the row from us had slicked back hair like in a 1950s movie and a white t-shirt and literally a pack of cigarettes rolled up in his sleeve. And you look at that guy and you look at geek me, because I looked even geekier then, we would think we had nothing whatsoever in common. But we were both sitting here watching this man talk about an optimistic future. And I think that the optimistic future is one of the things that really draws people to it. It's like, we're going to get past all this bickering and all this sniping and all this awfulness. And if we can do it, that's what's waiting for us. And I think that's a really powerful draw.
And that's stayed true all along. You know, the all the way to the most recent season of Discovery, where the solution, where the thing that caused all the horribleness wasn't some malevolent force, it was a kid who lost his mommy. You know, and the way to solve it was to basically, you know, bring him back home. And that's still, you know, that's still the heart of what makes Star Trek so appealing, is that it isn't about who's bigger and stronger. It's about who's nicer. You know?
Yeah.
I think
the Dominion War ended not because of a show of military force or military engagement, but because Odo offered to go home. You know.
And I think that's the perfect place to stop on that moment of hope. We'll quickly go through.
Here's Jason trying to corral all of us talking about this for hours.
Yeah, good luck with that. All right, so let's keep going.
So let's go around the room again. Let people know where they can find you online. I'll start with you, Nancy.
You can find my website at nancynorthcott.com. I have a Facebook page, Nancy Northcott Author, which I occasionally pop into. But the best place to find me is on Twitter, where I spend far more time than is good for me. And I'm at Nancy Northcott. And you can find my newest release on falstaffbooks.com.
All right. Jeannie?
I'm Jeanne Adams. You can find me at Jeanne Adams on just about all social media except Instagram, which I'm at JPA Griffin for that one. And like Nancy, I spend way too much time on Twitter. But and you can find me here on ConTinual a lot, and Nancy too. But most social media, you can find me Jeanne Adams, and you can find my releases on all digital platforms.
Keith?
Just search for Keith DeCandido. I'm the only one you're going to find. If you go to DeCandido.net, that is my incredibly terrible website, but it's a handy link dump to all the various places you can cyberstalk me. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram. I write for Tor.com. My stuff is available from all the usual online dealers. My most recent book is a book called All the Way House, which is the story of the Jersey Devil. It's the secret origin of the Jersey Devil. It's part of a series called Systema Paradoxa, which is about cryptids. Yeah, I'm very easy to find online. So just search my name and poof, I will appear.
All right. John.
I am John Jackson Miller, and that's the name you'll find me under on Facebook and Instagram. I guess those two are connected somehow. I don't know how.
Nobody knows.
I know. On
Wait till
Twitter,
they get busted
JJM
up, it'll be
Faraway. And then my website, farawaypress.com. I have behind the scenes notes on just about everything I've ever written, comic books, novels, games, magazines, that sort of thing. I also have a website called Comicron, COMICHRON.com. That is the world's largest public database of comic book sales figures. That also has a Twitter by that name and a Patreon by that name. And then, of course, the books. I'm not going to try to pick this thing up again, but if you don't get this now, you probably will never be able to find it for under $500. That's the Old Republic Omnibus. And then again, of course, on August 17th, Star Trek Picard, Rogue Elements, the origin story of Captain Rios, and that is available in hardcover, in ebook, and in audiobook, which I can't wait to hear read by Robert Petkoff.
He's good. I forgot. I have a Patreon and a YouTube channel, so you should check those out.
There you go.
Plus, you're on Continual.
And I'm on Continual a lot.
Here.
Yes.
Finally, Jim.
And you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, authoressentialsworkshops.com. I do show up some on Facebook and Instagram, and occasionally that Hive of Scum and Villainy, which is Twitter. A few other places as well. And of course, here at Continual. Occasionally they let me out of my box.
All right, I do want to thank everyone, and something tells me this won't be our last Star Trek related panel based on the wild yeah. The continuing
slightly
voyages. All right.
Everybody's grabbing their toys.
My Kalar action figure.
I'll see your guy and raise him a bird of prey over here.
All right. Thank you for watching. See you guys next time.